So a while back, people would gather around the radio and listen to the entertainment hour, or they would listen to the day's news um, as the main form of entertainment because they didn't really have much in the way of watching television because television hadn't been invented yet. And then later on, a variety of different sources would provide entertainment or other audio formats through various media. And then sometime around the mid 1990s, it happened. The digital divide. We started transitioning audio from the traditional analog method to the new digital technologies that were coming out. And so the digital divide basically separated with a way we did audio and video and a lot of telecommunications. So let's take a look at analog audio through the ages. So back in the late 1800s, we had the ability to listen to audio via a radio. Stations could broadcast an audio signal, and people at home could have these small little boxes that could receive it. And then in 1887, we had the ability to record audio, which was something we didn't have before. And so RCA had a device called a ventrola, I believe, and they were able to record audio onto a wax cylinder. And that led the birth to this little image of a dog listening to his owner's voice. And this portrait was actually called I think his master's voice, and it was the dog listening to a recorded voice of the guy that owned him. And this little dog had an interesting name. His name was Nipper. And so when RCA did their audition for this photo, they had a lot of different people bringing in different types of dogs to see which one would be the best. And there was a farmer that brought in his dog for the audition, and the dog would always grow up and he would bite at people's ankles, and he would always like nip at their ankles. And because of that, the farmer nicknamed him Nipper. But he wound up becoming known as the RCA dog, as the dog listening to the phonograph or the ventrola was the icon for this new generation of audio. So that stuck around for quite a few years. And then in the 1920s, we figured out how to save audio. Instead of just using a recorded wax cylinder that had like a little needle that would bump, we could now do it magnetically. And so we could store audio in these two tapes that would just kind of spin as one would deliver audio and then the other would pick it up. And then during the late 1940s, we were able to go back to the concept of the ventrilla, where we would have a needle that would pick up bumps and grooves. But what had changed was we now had the ability to mass produce these discs called vinyl records. And so they could make one master copy, whereas before you only had the original copy, you really couldn't duplicate it. But now that they could make massive amounts and hundreds and thousands of millions of these discs that they could press, and it revolutionized the way that people listen to audio, and particularly music, because now bands could record their songs and then distribute them onto vinyl records. And there are people out there who believe that vinyl is still the best way to listen to audio. And then in 1962, the audio cassette was invented. And the concept of the audio cassette was much like the reel-to-reel, where you had two spools, a magnetic tape being delivered from one side to the other. Only now they were smaller, encased in a plastic casing that helped protect it and made them more portable. And so the cassette tapes were around for quite some time. And then in 1965, they tried to revolutionize the way that the cassettes worked with a device known as the 8-track. And what this little cartridge did was it played like 4 streams of audio at the same time. And you would just press a button to listen to channel 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I think since they had stereo, you could have like 8 tracks, or you could have up to 8 tracks of mono. The downside is you couldn't rewind it. You would have to play it to the end, and then it would loop around and play it at the beginning. And if you wanted to go from one song to another, you would have to change to the second track. And if you were in the middle of the song, then you would have to fast forward to the end, and then you would start that over again. So the 8-tracks weren't really all that popular. They only lasted for about a decade, and cassettes just kind of took over. Now, on the other side, in the mid 90s, we started transitioning to computer technology that could capture audio that we weren't using before. So the first thing that came about was the compact disc. And it was a similar concept to the vinyl records that had, in the records, there were like bumps and grooves that a needle could ride on top of, and that needle could reproduce audio. But with the DVDs, or sorry, the CDs, they were now using a technology of ones and zeros recorded onto a foil disc. And a laser would read that information. And it could interpret the ones and zeros as a digital signal that it could then translate back into audio. And then we came up with the concept of taking all these audio files and putting them onto a portable hard drive. So thus, one of the major players in the world of digital audio was Apple. And they released a device called the iPod. And the iPod was the ability to just have an entire library of audio, being able to have it in the palm of your hand. Whereas with vinyl, you would have to have a record player, or with CDs, you would have stacks and stacks of CDs. Well, now you could take hundreds, maybe even 1,000 CDs and put them on these portable pods. And this was done because we now had digital files for audio in the form of MP3s and WAV files. And so you could take these audio files and you could redistribute them either through electronic mail to your friends. You can make a copy of the CD, or you could even put it on a USB drive and hand that to your friends. And the thing about digital audio is that it would never lose quality. With analog, every time you made a copy, you would lose a little bit of information. And so when you make a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, so much information has been lost that it's not going to sound nearly as good as the first pressing of the audio. But with digital, it's the same quality no matter how many times you duplicate it and pass it on. So that led to a new industry coming around known as pirated music. And this would be a case where someone would take a audio file of their favorite song or take an album of their favorite artist, and they would upload it to a various pirate service that could then freely distribute it to anybody who wanted access to it. And this was considered, and this is considered an illegal method, because people are not paying for the rights, or they're not paying for the music. They're basically just stealing it from somebody else. And so a lot of the music companies, the music industry, have been fighting tooth and nail to stop all these various types of pirating services, to keep the rights and keep the media their sole possession. Now, one of the things that also came out was a revolution, or an evolution, in radio, and this came from satellite radio. So for a while, there were two major companies, Sirius Satellite and XM, and I think they merged into a new company called Sirius XM. And so these are companies that will beam a signal up to the satellites. They will broadcast that signal back down, and anybody with a radio that has a satellite receiver can receive multiple channels of audio that has specific types of music. So there may be a channel for rock and roll, or for rhythm and blues, or for comedy. There may be public radio or talk radios channels that may follow conservative topics or liberal topics, or things along those lines. And then there was we shifted from satellite radio, because if you lost sight of the satellite, you would lose your signal. If you went through a downtown area of a populated city, or if you went into a tunnel, you'd lose your connection. So since we're now able to broadcast data a lot easier using things like our cellular phones, they're able to pick up these signals, and we can now play music in the same way. So music services came around, like Google Music, Pandora, Spotify, Amazon MP3. And now it gives us the ability to broadcast audio to our cell phone, and we can pick and choose the types of music or media that suits our needs. So when we're dealing with analog to digital audio, it's typically referenced in what's called a sampling rate. And when it samples something, it sort of takes like a snapshot or a picture of either the video or audio. and then it saves that information. And there is going to be a change in the audio from one snapshot to the other. But the technology in this particular case, one of the standards that we use now, is what's known as a 48K sample rate. So in 1 second, it's going to take 48,000 snapshots of that audio file going from one piece to the next. There's still going to be a gap in the audio that's going to be missing, but at 48,000 times, or one snapshot every 20 microseconds, the human brain really can't differentiate what's being lost in that case. And so depending on how good you want that audio, it's going to depend on the sample rate. If you want like a 41K or 44K or 48K is usually one of the main ones we're going to look at. And then with this instantaneous snapshot, it's then converted into computer data, which becomes a series of ones or zeros. And then by combining the different ones and zeros in certain combinations, you get a piece of information, if it's audio, if it's video. In the case of the word music, if I take M and convert it to ones and zeros, I will get this string of numbers. And then there's U, there's S, there's I, and whoops, and there's like K behind me. So by just looking at this series of either ones or zeros, or like in the vinyl records, a bump or a groove, you're able to save all this information and recall it at a moment's notice. So when we're dealing with analog, one of the things about analog was that it was hard to copy. It was a lossy format, because whenever you made a copy of a copy of a copy, you're always losing some quality in it. But with digital, you get, and especially, with analog, especially over long distances like radio, you would lose some of the quality of the radio signal over distances. And so you would still not have the best type of audio. But with digital, it's going to be the same format and the same information again and again and again. So this is what's called a lossless format. And so there's types of files like waves, MP3s, FLACs that can be considered lossless when you're duplicating the audio. And because it records that range, it's always going to have that information. So a lot of times, up until about 4 years ago, MP3 was the king of audio. And the Fraunhofer Institute basically claimed in April of 2017 that the patents for MP3s were coming to an end, and they really weren't going to renew them. And they said in a statement that there are more efficient audio codecs with advanced features than what MP3 can do today. However, most state-of-the-art services are still using some MP3s, and they're starting to shift over to newer technologies for better types of audio. So Apple picked up the AAC format, also known as the Advanced Audio Codec. And so this is able to have a relatively small file with a lot of information. Spotify, with their streaming, instead of using MP3 or the AAC, they're using one called the OGG Vorbis format. And again, they're able to get a good bit of information in a relatively small file size when they're streaming that. And so as we're starting to move away from 2017, we're starting to see that MP3s are being used less and less, and files like FLAC, AAC, and OGG are becoming more prominent in how often they are used. So that's kind of what's going on with the world of audio, in that how we mix it and how we use it, and especially how audio changed from analog to digital when